Hello everybody, welcome to this video. It is the 1st of May in 2012 and we are here in Limache, Chile. I'm sitting here with Howard Richards. He is a philosopher of social science. I'm planning to write a book, I'm working on a book on humiliation and terrorism. And I persuaded dear Howard to think about that topic. And he is so kind as to share his thoughts with us now. Thank you.
Well, I have some thoughts on terrorism, and my first thought is I wish we didn't have to talk about it, because I don't like the word. I wish the word were not part of our vocabulary. And I have two main reasons. The first one is that it tends to name people who have low-tech weaponry, and to make a distinction between people who resort to violence, who can't afford drones and very sophisticated computer equipment to aim their guided missiles, so they resort to homemade bombs carried by suicide bombers. Those people get called terrorists. I think that's a mistaken distinction. Some of us believe that nonviolence is the way to go all the time. Others believe in a just war. Even just wars don't happen very often. But in neither case is it really relevant what kind of weapons you have. And when people fight wars with the weapons at hand, and their weapons at hand tend to be those of poor people, they call them terrorists. So I think that's a bad word for that reason, because it makes a distinction based on wealth and technology that's not really relevant to the merits of resorting to violence, nor that much to how you go about resolving it to create a culture of peace. And the second reason is that George Bush defined terrorists as people we will not talk to. By definition of terrorists, we do not talk to. And I think that's entirely mistaken. The whole point of peacemaking and peace building is that you do talk. Right. And you try to reach an understanding. That's my first preliminary point. I'm going to use the word, but I wish I didn't have to. Secondly, I'm not going to say anything about Johan Galtung or Fisher and Urey or Jean-Paul Lederach or Adam Curl or Betty Reardon. They've said many valuable things about negotiating and making peace, and it's not that I disagree with them. It's just that I have something else to say, and I'm going to try to add with the sort of mention that there are already many very good things written about how to deal with terrorists. And I'm not disagreeing with it. I'm simply adding some thoughts of my own. Well, I have three thoughts of my own. Another one is not really, as far as I know, the first three are pretty original with me. Maybe not, but there's always in precedent somewhere for every thought. The fourth one is maybe published, but not very well known anyway. Well, my first point is this, that people were not evolved or were not meant to live without moral authority. It's a characteristic of human cultures that people want, expect, and need authority, and terrorists are not different from anyone else in this respect. And it's a lack of respect for them to not deal with what they regard as moral authority. So if some really incredible speeches by Tony Blair. I don't know if you ever run across him, or he justifies the British and U.S. intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of, modernization and autonomy. And he goes so far as to claim that people have a right to their autonomy as understood in sort of Western moral philosophy, whether they want it or not. And we have a right to militarily intervene to give them the rights that they have a right to. So the whole sort of discourse of rights and a sort of secular concept of moral authority, according to Blair, you can impose by military force. Of course, I don't know how much that has to do with the real reasons why these countries went to war, but in terms of its sort of philosophical rationale, I think goes in the category of plainly mistaken. And very insulting, because the human beings who have different belief systems are human beings too, and that you won't go to the table and talk to them because the kind of thinking they do doesn't count, because it has been overruled by by Immanuel Kant and his followers in Western moral philosophy, and that I think is no way to make peace. So I'm for doing theology. I'm for doing theology.
Mm-hmm.
If we're,
yes, and you spent all day today in church, didn't you?
That's right. That's right. I'm into religion myself. I'm wearing a Franciscan sweater.
Mm-hmm.
I'm into the Franciscan branch. But in talking to Muslims, lots of terrorists, of course, are not Muslims. But let's say more Muslim, for example. We need to talk Islam. We need to make a case for the moral authority of a peaceful, cooperative approach. And of course, we may not do it ourselves. There are specialists in Islamic theology and it's not hard to find people who are very good at deriving a peace message from Islam or from any religion, whatever. Saoud al-Mawla is one I happen to know. He's a very good Muslim theologian who can negotiate with people in respectful language for what they regard as moral authority. And that's one thing I think we need to do with terrorists. We have to speak their language and make a case in terms of their concept of what it is of right and wrong, and of what it is to be a human being, and so on. Not that we'll necessarily convince them only that way, but at least it's the right way to proceed is to have assuming these people are religious, many terrorists are not religious, but assuming they are, then we need a theological discussion with people who take theological premises for their action. And my second point would be that we need to make a strong emotional appeal. Mm-hmm. It's just as a matter of respect, we should make a rational argument based on their sense of authority. But as people don't really act all that much for reasons. Mm-hmm. And so that means if we're going to build peace or persuade people or move people from war to peace, we have got to appeal to feelings. Mm. Well, how do we do that? Well, I guess first we consult Evelin. Evelin knows those things. I don't know much about it, but so why am I talking to you? Why am I just listening to you? But I do have a couple of thoughts. Mm. And one is we need to learn the biochemistry of emotions. We need to study the structure of the brain. Authors like Melvin Konner, for example, who sort of go into all the research literature on the sort of physical basis of human emotions. But human emotions are never straight physical. They're always mediated by culture. So it's the sort of potential emotional appeal that you might learn by studying the chemistry of the human body and the electricity of the human brain. You'll never actually going to be able to apply until you're an insider in some culture where these things are. And the short answer is always we don't know. We don't know what the promising emotional appeal is, but that's what we have to do. We're not going to be able to communicate persuasively with terrorists unless we can talk their language and move them emotionally. And my third point is to solve the material problem. And by the material problem, I don't mean meeting their demands. As we want autonomy, we want our own state, we want our language taught, I don't mean specifically meeting their demands. I do think many demands of so-called terrorists are quite reasonable and should be met. And I also think that some of the writers I've mentioned, others have written very good things about how you negotiate what the issues are. But there's always an underlying interest in making a living. And it's always important that there be a physical solution to people's problems. And if you can't solve the problems physically, then you can't solve them culturally and psychologically in terms of coming to a conclusion. I remember some of my Palestinian friends telling me at an international conference, they say we're Muslims, but that's not really important. What we want is economic opportunity. It's the desperate poverty that is our concern, and the fact that we're Muslims has really very little to do with our conflict with the Israelis. I have another friend at the American University in Cairo who done a lot of research on ethnic conflict throughout the Middle East and the former Soviet area in Eastern Europe. And he says, well, the theology may be medieval, but the concerns are very much up-to-date and practical. That, people need to make a living. And in that respect, we simply are bankrupt. We have this tragic situation where we have a global world system which calls itself the global community and stands for the principles of rule of law. But the rule of law that it stands for can't possibly solve the material problem.
That's right.
So there's a tendency to say you negotiate a truce, and then you develop some way of carrying out the terms of the truce, and then you send in the social economic development experts to do social and economic development. But what on earth is social and economic development? Well, it means getting to be like Europe, getting to be like the United States. But Europe and the United States are dysfunctional societies. They don't work. So why on earth are we trying to persuade the rest of the world to follow a pattern which obviously doesn't work? I mean, that's sort of the obvious empirical point. But one can also, and I have, and the other authors have shown sort of logically, scientifically, why it won't work. That is why we can't possibly include everybody in markets, because markets depend on sales. And if you don't have anything to sell that someone else will buy, who has the purchasing power to buy and the desire to buy, then you cannot make a living in a market. That's basic Keynes. Keynes tells us there is a chronic weakness of effective demand. That means that we cannot solve the problem of poverty by expecting everybody to get in the business of selling something to somebody. It just won't work. And so if we think that the material problems of terrorists in poor countries are going to be solved by development experts from Harvard, showing them how to make their country like Massachusetts, which is one of the biggest percentages of people in prison of any place in the world, then it simply won't work. We have to change to a different concept of economics that, as I've been saying before in various ways, a plural economy with different logic that's able to be inclusive. And until we do, we're going to have terrorists, we're going to have delinquents, we're going to have a drug culture, we're going to have a number of other sort of undesirable industries, because these undesirable industries create employment. There's some ways people make a living. People make a living by terrorism. That's one of the things I think you must have learned as you studied African terrorism is, people make a living by looting and sort of making provisions for their terrorist army. So until we have a physical material alternative, we're not really going to do it with terrorism. That's my 3 points, which I think are a little different from anything the other authors have said. My fourth point is another very helpful thing to do is to rewrite history.
Wow.
Right. I can give an example of how that worked, and that was some successful reconciliation in the South African province of KwaZulu-Natal of the ANC and the KwaZulu-Natal, the African National Congress and the Ankatha Freedom Party. I said that wrong before. Have been fighting, a very bloody fighting, and going on for years. And when they succeeded in reconciling, they made an ANC person governor of the province, and the assistant governor was from Ankatha Freedom Party. They had a number of provisions, but one was they were going to re-understand their history. Wow. And what they decided to do was they were going to blame it on apartheid. The reason for all this black-on-black violence was because apartheid sort of put them up to it. And now that apartheid was gone, there was no reason for more black-on-black violence. So they were going to teach their children a version of history that would not sort of cement the bitterness generation after generation. Wow. And I think that's a very good, very important for everywhere in the world. You can think of many cases where their little kids grow up learning whom they're supposed to hate and why. Yes. And that comes from history books. So finding interpretations of history that do not justify revenge in the present, I think is an important part of dealing with terrorists and peacemaking in general. So those are a few thoughts on terrorism.
Wonderful. We are here in Chile, and I just learned that there are protests going on in the south of Chile, and these people are called terrorists. If you have any ideas or examples or thoughts, and could explain the local situation, if you want to, if you can, I don't know.
Well, as another reason why we should not have the word terrorist, that it's just a pretext for not dealing with them as real human beings, to call them terrorists,
Right.
to say, well, we're justified in using violence because the only thing they understand is violence. So why? Well, because they're terrorists.
Right.
So I think that's a misused word. How we actually deal with the indigenous population of Chile, I would repeat the same remarks, that we need to understand Mapuche culture, what is moral authority in the Mapuche vision of the world. There are people who do this. There are people who are not Mapuches. Our neighbor Gaston Sublet, who made very profound studies of the Mapuche, cosmology and way of seeing things. We have to speak to them in their language, not insist that they talk in our language, or try to bridge the languages. We have to appeal emotionally, and they need a real physical solution. They have a physical disaster. They've been living in forests which have been cut down. They've been replaced with eucalyptus trees, which are not useful for their purposes, which are used for timber. That's one example. They're sort of being physically driven from their land, and they don't understand the sort of dynamics of why this is happening to them. Those of us who at least think we understand the dynamics of why it's happening to them need to contribute by finding ways to reverse those dynamics, to make it possible for diverse cultures to exist in a world that is not dominated by the overriding necessity to make money wherever money can be made, even if it means destroying forests and destroying cultures. That's a little bit schematic, but I suppose maybe the bottom line here is that no matter how much we work on intercultural understanding and how well we show that it's an ecological disaster to do what's happening in the south of Chile and in the Amazon and in other parts of the world, we won't really solve the problem until the dominant global dynamic is no longer dominant.
What would you advise people who are labeled terrorists? What would you advise them if they now watch this video? I'm talking really mostly to the real terrorists. So those are the people who are calling other people terrorists and dealing with them in human ways. I would like to persuade people, the terrorists. Okay, now let's talk about the people who are terrorists. Using violence, you mean, or what would you say?
Now we'll talk about terrorism in the way it's normally used. We'll talk about, minority groups who use violence for often ethnic ends. I would like to persuade them that their legitimate aims can more easily be achieved by nonviolence and by building cooperation. I would like to persuade them that that's the case. And I think it probably is the case. It's probably much more likely that they would achieve their ends. And I think we can cite evidence on this. Stephen Zunes, I think, has compiled quite a bit of evidence tending to show this is the case and referred to others. You can look up Stephen Zunes on anywhere and you'll find tons of material he's written. I think he thinks we're telling most of the truth when we tell people who are resorting to terrorist tactics that they would be better off using nonviolence and constructive program in the Gandhian sort of tradition. Nonetheless, what we want to be true is not entirely true, and it would be much more true if we could persuade people on the other side, the people in the sort of anti-terrorism establishment, that they should be working along the sort of lines that I and the other authors I mentioned are proposing.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Well, you're quite welcome.
Is this all you want to say, or?
No, I think that's all I want to say right now. I hope it was clear. If there's something that wasn't clear, I'd like to...